Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Mary Beth Matthews, and I'm very glad to welcome you to the second of two lectures this semester, sponsored by the Khatib program in Religion and Dialogue. This one is called, as you can see, Islamophobia, What We All Should Know and Do About Anti-Muslim Discrimination. The Khatib program was funded by Dr. Reza Khatib, a retired Iranian neurosurgeon, who, along with his late wife, Georgiana Clifford Khatib, was horrified to watch in New York the events of 9/11. As a response, the Khatibs decided to fund a program that seeks to promote and advance interreligious dialogue among people of different faith traditions. Fortunately for UMW, our retired colleague, Dr. Mehdi Amin Razavi, happened to meet Dr. Khatib and convince him to locate the program here. Here at UMW, the program offers an academic credit-bearing course every academic year. Recent offerings have included Religion and Politics in Islam, Religion and Anime, and Ethics and Violence in Religion. If you are looking for a course to add next semester, if you're a student, our speaker this evening, Dr. Jordan Denari Duffner, is going to be teaching Jesus and Muhammad, the Bible and the Quran. And it will be synchronous and online, if that sounds interesting to you. We have also held conferences, and like this evening, we have sponsored lectures. Tonight, we are honored to host Dr. Duffner, who has experience both in the classroom and in consulting, helping students and the larger community understand the importance of interreligious dialogue. Her areas of specialization include Christian-Muslim interactions and facilitating communications between different faith groups. She received her PhD from Georgetown University in Theological and Religious Studies. Already a prolific author, Dr. Duffner has written award-winning books, including Finding Jesus Among Muslims, How Loving Islam Makes Me a Better Catholic in 2017, and a book on Islamophobia. Please welcome me. I hate doing these things, sorry. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Duffner.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth, and thank you all for being here. It's a joy to be back here at UMW. I was here a few years ago, giving a talk for the Khatib program and also some of the Muslim life events on campus, and so it's really wonderful to be back. Before I begin my presentation, I want to answer a question that might be going through some of your heads right now, which is, why is this person, who is presumably not Muslim, giving a talk on Islamophobia, a form of bigotry that targets Muslims? And you would be right, I am not Muslim. I study Muslim-Christian relations, sort of broadly construed, as Mary Beth mentioned. But much of my work has focused specifically on Islamophobia, and part of the reason for this really emerges from my own personal story. So I want to share some of that with you to start out. As we were just talking about up front, I'm originally from the Midwest, from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I grew up Catholic, and I'm still a practicing Catholic. And like many people of my generation, and I am a millennial, the September 11th attacks were sort of a defining moment in my political consciousness as a young person. Muslims were always in the news, and Islam was always on our TV screens, and usually the portrayal was a pretty negative one. But at the same time as I see all of this negative media portrayal about Muslims, I was actually meeting Muslims in my daily life, at the Catholic school that I was attending, and some extracurricular activities that I was doing. And I was also starting to learn about Islam. Like many young people, I was sort of going on my own spiritual journey at the time, learning about other traditions, trying to grapple with my own upbringing. And in that process, I sort of realized that the perception that many Americans had of Islam and Muslims was not accurate and didn't really reflect the Islam or the Muslims that I knew personally. And so there was this disconnect that I saw to be a problem. And I saw that many people, specifically in my faith community, many Catholics and many Christians, were scared of Muslims, and they saw Muslims as a threat. And I'll tell a story from one afternoon back in the spring of 2008. A chain email came into my inbox. This was, the days before social media. Facebook was still sort of a very sort of primitive version of itself. And the way that people spread information online was through these chain emails. And so this chain email comes into my inbox, and I saw that it had circulated through many really sort of well-respected and prominent individuals in my own Catholic parish community, Catholic church community. And the email was what we would now call, Islamophobic. It was portraying Muslims as this group that was not to be trusted, and saying that that Muslims were our enemy, and that they had really failed to speak up against the fanatics in their ranks. And the anonymous author of this chain email basically said that ordinary Muslims were irrelevant, and that instead we should pay attention to, as the email put it, the only group that counts, the fanatics who threaten our way of life. And then the author of this email urged readers to send this email to as many people as they could. And that's what my Catholic faith community had done. And so I was really distressed and disturbed by what the message said, and how it cast Muslims as sort of this universal danger and universal enemy, and sought to engender fear towards people like my Muslim classmates at the time. And my concern about all of this was compounded by the fact that this email was circulated by good people, by people that I knew, people who were well-intentioned, close family friends, people who very much claimed and espoused our values of hospitality and welcome and things like that. Okay. The folks sending around this email were not meaning to cause harm. But sending around the message was indeed really harmful, because something like this can have really dire consequences. And so as I saw it, this chain email that was sent around was not just a problem because what it said about Muslims, but also what it said about us, the community that I came from. And so a lot of my work over the last several years has been trying to correct this disconnect, to help upend Islamophobia, not only to be in solidarity with friends who are Muslim, but also to help my fellow Americans, and particularly my own faith community in general, to live up to our ideals of hospitality and welcoming diversity and things like that. So I initially thought I was going to go into journalism, maybe be a foreign correspondent in the Middle East, and so as Mary Beth mentioned, I did both my undergrad and graduate work at Georgetown. And so I was studying Arabic. I decided to study abroad in the country of Jordan, which was sort of a fun experience, with my first name being Jordan. It was a great sort of icebreaker. And, as sort of an aside, my maiden name, Dinari, is Italian, but sounds very much like the currency in Jordan, or in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, the dinar. And so I would go to the bank and they would say, "Hi, what's your name?" And I would say, "Jordan Dinari." And they would say, "No, we know you want our money, but what's your name?" And I'm like, that is my name. So it was a great sort of icebreaker for my time in the Middle East. And as much as I loved my time there, what I ultimately realized is that there was still a lot of work to do sort of at home in interreligious relations here in the United States. And so I ended up coming back to the U.S. and started working at an organization, or a sort of research center at Georgetown called the Bridge Initiative. And this was founded around 2014, and our goal was to sort of research and educate not just the academic community, but also the public about this growing problem of Islamophobia. The term Islamophobia wasn't even really being used widely at that time. So we would write reports and do fact sheets and produce lots of different materials on this problem of Islamophobia. And as I ended up going back to school for my PhD, I also started working on this book about Islamophobia. And so a lot of what I'm going to be sharing this evening comes out of my work on Islamophobia, or my book on Islamophobia. And you'll see the book is written sort of for a Christian audience. But I hope, and I've written it in such a way that I think a lot of the lessons and just some of the facts that I provide, I think, can be helpful to us regardless of our own identity or sort of positionality. When I wrote this book, it was sort of during the last days of the first Trump administration, and it came out in 2021. And that was sort of an interesting time for the book to come out because on the face of it, sort of Islamophobia was kind of waning at the time. We were seeing not a huge reduction, but sort of a lull in hate crimes against Muslims. We weren't seeing anti-Muslim political rhetoric to the degree that we had been, say, in 2015, 2016, 2017, during the presidential campaign, which brought President Trump to office the first time. So, when I came out with this book, I was sort of hoping that it would be kind of irrelevant by this point. It seemed like we sort of moved past some of these problems. And now we come to the situation that we're in today. Islamophobia, I think, has become a problem in a renewed way in our current moment. Right now we are seeing both a surge in anti-Muslim hate crimes and incidents, but also in how Muslims are being targeted in subtler ways. And we can see this in some of the data. So I don't have I wish I could have found an updated chart of anti-Muslim hate crimes from the 90s up until today, but one has yet to be made of that entire sort of 25-year period. But to give you just a sense, in 2022, there were 158 anti-Muslim hate crimes charted by the FBI, which is actually like a high number compared to what things were, say, back before September 11th, 2001. We can talk a little bit more about that. But then in 2023, the hate crimes spiked considerably to 236. We don't yet have the numbers for 2024, and then obviously we're still sort of in the early stages of 2025. But I anticipate that the numbers for 2024 and 2025 will be higher. And I think there's a number of reasons for this spike, but one of them is what I see as the really problematic reactions that people in this country have had to the violence that we're seeing abroad in Israel-Palestine. And we're not just seeing a surge in anti-Muslim incidents, but also anti-Arab, specifically anti-Palestinian, and anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic incidents too. And this is because Americans are engaging in what I see as collective blaming, basically seeing all Muslims and all Arabs as responsible collectively for the actions of a group like Hamas on October 7th of 2023, or seeing Jews as collectively responsible for the actions of Israel in Gaza. And so this collective blaming is obviously a problem. And it stems from this, I think, wrong-headed idea that the situation in Israel-Palestine is rooted in religion, and that it's somehow sort of a Muslim-Jewish conflict. And I very much would argue that it's not, and we can sort of talk about why that is later on if we like. But this kind of thinking, this collective blaming, has really devastating consequences in terms of hate crimes. And one of the worst hate crimes that has occurred in this environment was the murder of a 6-year-old Palestinian-American Muslim boy whose name was Wadi al-Fayoumi, who was killed in Chicago in October 2023. The man who killed him was actually his family's landlord, and came from my faith community. He was a Catholic. And he allegedly said to this boy and his mom, "You Muslims have to die. You are killing our kids in Israel. Palestinians deserve to die." And so this is sort of the extreme consequence of the kind of bigotry that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, Islamophobia is a much broader issue than Israel-Palestine, but we are going to circle back to it a number of times this evening to talk about how these two things are sort of connected. But at the outset, I do want us to think critically also about how these issues are framed. Because I think sometimes when we focus so much on the issue of religious bigotry in this moment, we can erase some of the political dimensions of the conflict, and might even kind of contribute to what I see as sort of a problematic notion that this is a religious conflict. So I want us to be really cognizant of that and to resist that. I think also in talking about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as this series, I think importantly does, we also though have to be on guard that we're not framing this as Jews being anti-Muslim and Muslims being anti-Jewish, because that's not necessarily the primary dynamic that's going on. Oftentimes it is Christians who are engaging in acts of violence or bigotry towards either or both of these communities. So obviously this is a talk on Islamophobia, and we're going to get into that definition and all these different dynamics shortly. But I also do want to talk a bit about how we define bigotry broadly, and talk a little bit about anti-Semitism too, because I think it's really important for us to be clear how we are defining these forms of bigotry and how we are then deploying these labels. Because right now, one of the challenging dynamics that we're facing is that there are some prominent organizations and figures and politicians who are using charges of anti-Semitism to delegitimize some of the activism that's going on for the rights of Palestinians. And so these are just some dynamics that I think we need to name when we're talking about these larger issues of bigotry here in the United States and how it relates to the situation abroad in the Holy Land. So I want to begin by defining the word Islamophobia, because by the word's etymology alone, Islamophobia would simply seem to mean fear of Islam, a phobia of Islam. But for me, the word denotes something broader and deeper than, say, an individual's personal aversion to Islam or Muslims' religion. I don't think we're talking simply about an irrational fear here. So the way that I define Islamophobia is prejudice and discrimination that targets people based on their perceived association with Islam and Muslims. So that's kind of a mouthful. And I want to talk a little about what I mean with this definition and name some important components of the definition. The definition includes both how people think and feel about Muslims, the attitudes they may have, the prejudice that they may have, but also how Muslims are actually treated. So things like hate crimes, things like government policies and discrimination, things like that. Sorry, just looking at my notes. This definition also includes examples of overt Islamophobia or overt bigotry. So we can think of things like blatant fear-mongering. I think back to the 2016 political campaign where many of the Republican nominees for president were basically trying to outcompete each other by with the negative things about Muslims that they were saying or the negative policy proposals towards Muslims that they were advocating. Or we can think of things like the Muslim ban that was instituted by President Trump in his first term. At the same time, Islamophobia can also be subtle. So it could be things like covert government programs or law enforcement policies, efforts to spy or surveil Muslim communities. And when we're talking about subtle Islamophobia, it's not just programs that are actively kept quiet, but I think also sometimes unintentional forms of prejudice. So, we can think about implicit bias or unintentional stereotyping that we might be doing without even sort of realizing it. And I think this is something that we sort of understand from our study of other forms of bigotry and racism too, that we can be purveyors of bigotry even when we don't intend to be. And so, Islamophobia as a problem is something that goes beyond any kind of consciously held beliefs about Muslims that we may have. And again, so this idea of implicit bias. Islamophobia impacts Muslims, obviously, but it also impacts people who are not Muslim too. Because non-Muslims who are perceived to be Muslim are often targeted. And so this is why those of the Sikh faith, Arab Christians, and others are caught in the crosshairs of Islamophobia at times. I can think of, there are so many examples, but one example that often comes to mind for me is an Arab American Christian whose name was Khalid Jabara, who was killed in 2015 by his neighbor, I think in Oklahoma, who called him and his family Muslims, among some other slurs he sort of leveled at them before killing Khalid. Another, I think, important component to the definition, or something we need to think about, is that Islamophobia can be conceptualized as a form of racism. And again, this is not because Muslims are a race. Muslims are, I think, around 2 billion people globally, coming from every sort of racial and ethnic background you can imagine. So it's not that Muslims are a race, but it's rather because we in Western society often treat Muslims as a race. We treat them as such. We imagine Muslims to be a group that shares sort of a set of inherent traits. And so this is not only the case for things like physical or ethnic traits. So basically we assume that Muslims have brown skin, and we assume that they speak Arabic, and we assume that they come from the Middle East, or they wear certain kinds of clothing. But Islamophobia is also racialized in the sense that we assume that Muslims also have certain negative behavioral or cultural qualities. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we assume that Muslims have these particular qualities, these particular stereotypes. And so I want to talk about some of the common anti-Muslim stereotypes that exist. And you'll notice as I'm talking about these that a lot of these overlap with the stereotypes that are often leveled or deployed against other groups as well. And we'll talk more about that sort of overlap between other forms of bigotry later on. But the first one is that this wrong-headed view that Muslims are inherently prone to violence. So this is your sort of quintessential Muslim terrorist trope. Then there is the trope of Muslims being misogynistic, this idea that Muslim men are oppressive to women and that Muslim women themselves are oppressed. And this is often sort of visualized through the hijab, the scarf that some Muslim women will wear. There's also this trope or this stereotype that Muslims are naturally sort of intolerant of other religious groups. And we're, I think, really seeing this stereotype, we're seeing a resurgence in it today, because I think it plays a lot into how Palestinians and Arabs are viewed, again, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's been some work out of, I believe, Rutgers talking about how there's sort of this assumption that Muslims or Arabs or Palestinians are inherently anti-Semitic, and so that sort of portrayal or perception can play into how people interpret the Israel-Palestine situation. Another one of the tropes is that Muslims are inherently foreign, that they're not from here, that they're not part of America or the West. And there was an example of this actually that I just saw yesterday. I think it happened a few days or weeks ago now. But the Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's ex-husband was actually recorded berating really sort of atrociously some Muslim women who were praying in a parking garage in Georgia. They were actually celebrating the Eid holiday, the Muslim holiday marking the end of Ramadan. And he sort of goes on this tirade and says, "You're not from here, you need to leave," and like, we were born here. And he did eventually apologize publicly in a public press conference, which I feel like we don't often see that sort of thing happen nowadays. So that was really positive to see. But still, I mean, this is a very troubling incident that he would even do something like this in the first place. Some other tropes, that Muslims are tyrannical, that they want to impose their religion or their way of life on other people, or this idea that they'll be more loyal to their own foreign or religious law than to U.S. law. So this idea that Muslims are seditious and that they're not trustworthy. Then there's these other tropes of Muslims being backwards or, as I said, untrustworthy, things like that. And so these stereotypes kind of ebb and flow. Sometimes some of them are more prominent than others, but these are some of the main ones that are common in Western discourse about Muslims. And so I want to talk about how these sort of figure into Islamophobia. So the logic of Islamophobia goes that these negative qualities are seen as defining Muslims as a group, and then it leads us to see Muslims as inherently different from the rest of society and potentially worthy of poor treatment or harsher treatment, because if Muslims are this, then they deserve to be treated differently. That's the false logic of Islamophobia. I think it's also helpful to see Islamophobia as a form of scapegoating. I didn't put the word on the slide, but I think Islamophobia is just one sort of iteration of this universal human tendency that we have to blame someone or to blame a group for our problems. This belief that things will get better if we just get rid of this other group or expel this group or mistreat this other group. And we've seen this throughout the history of the United States and also certainly in many other parts of the world as well. I want to say a little bit more about the term Islamophobia, because I recognize that it is not a perfect word linguistically, but it's the word that we have, and so I think we should use it. Other terms for denoting bigotry are also not maybe linguistically perfect either. People can look at the term anti-Semitism and say, oh well, it doesn't really linguistically mean exactly how we use it. But again, we know how to use this word, and even though it Islamophobia is more than a phobia of Islam, I think it's really important that we have a term to label the bigotry that we are talking about and that we see. And it's actually, as a scholar of Islamophobia and someone who has sort of worked on this issue before this word was widely adopted, I've been really sort of happy to see that it has become adopted by scholars and journalists, and I think even the Pope has used it. It's sort of assumed now to be the term for anti-Muslim bigotry in a way that it was not 10 years ago when I was doing some of this work in the earlier days of the Bridge Initiative. It's also important for us to talk about what isn't Islamophobia, because again, we don't want to apply these sorts of labels of bigotry in unwarranted ways or in sort of sweeping ways that are not justified. So when we are, I want to say that critiques of Muslim persons or groups or even sort of debating aspects of Islam as a religious tradition are certainly not Islamophobic, or they're not inherently Islamophobic. Critique and debate and all of these things is very important. The time that we have to sort of be careful or on guard is when we hear people using untrue generalizations or some of these stereotypes when we're talking about Islam and Muslims. So if someone is criticizing a Muslim group for their something horrible they've done, that's obviously important. That would need to be called out and to be criticized. However, when we're engaging in collective blaming and we're implying that all Muslims are sort of responsible for this, or that all Muslims sort of would endorse what this group has done, that obviously is something that that we want to not do. Not treat Muslims and their faith tradition as sort of a monolithic way. So now I want to move on to talk about some of the big takeaways from my book on Islamophobia, basically highlight the main points of my book on Islamophobia that I think will help us to dive into some of these facets a little bit deeper and understand what Islamophobia looks like and how it affects people. So it's a little bit hard to know where to start charting the history of Islamophobia. You could start at, some of my teachers from Georgetown years ago would start talking about this. The starting point is being 1979, the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis, and this is when sort of American Islamophobia really started. Others want to say that 9/11 in 2001, the terrorist attacks on the U.S. and then sort of the aftermath of that was sort of the key moment for Islamophobia. There's lots of really sort of pivotal historical events that we can point to that maybe weren't the genesis of Islamophobia, but I think really shaped sort of the trajectory of anti-Muslim bigotry in the United States in an important way. And I do think 9/11 was one of those key moments. And you can see in this chart here how in 2001 there was a surge, this chart here just shows anti-Muslim assault, so like physical attacks against Muslims, but the overall anti-Muslim hate crimes was actually way higher than this too. But we can see that anti-Muslim violence was pretty minimal before 9/11, and then after 9/11 it's much, much higher. So 9/11 was sort of a pivotal moment for how Muslims are treated in this country. We also see Islamophobic sentiment and hate crimes often surge during election cycles. So what's really interesting is that Islamophobia doesn't always track with terrorist attacks or attacks by Muslims on the U.S. So we can think about the Fort Hood shooting in 2009 or the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. There were not surges in anti-Muslim violence those years. Oftentimes the surges in Islamophobia happen during election cycles when politicians realize that they can sort of capitalize on fear in order to win elections. And then sometimes also when there are certain foreign events abroad. So ISIS being in the news a lot during President Trump's campaign 10 years ago in 2015, 2016 was also sort of a key moment for that too. And over this sort of 2-decade period, I mean, we don't have all the years here on this chart, Islamophobia is becoming more blatant and more overt. And one of the questions that I was asking in my work was why? Why was Islamophobia becoming more overt over time? Why was, then candidate Trump openly advocating for something like a ban on Muslims coming to the country, which, previously I think would have been unthinkable even to someone like me who studies something like this. And I think the answer to this question is that Islamophobia is not organic. Islamophobia is not simply the result of people not knowing Muslims or not knowing anything about Islam. It's not simply about ignorance. Because anti-Muslim attitudes are sometimes and often purposefully generated or harnessed for other aims, as we've already talked about, sometimes political aims. Islamophobia, in some quarters, has become an industry. There are nonprofit organizations and sort of these pseudo think tanks and political commentators, authors, bloggers, who make a lot of money and who have built careers off of maligning Muslims. And what was really troubling for me as, again, someone who studies this, is these folks used to be fairly fringe. In the early 2000s, these people were writing sort of obscure blogs online. Maybe they were appearing on cable television programs and writing books and things like that, but they didn't have direct connections to the top, the halls of political power. But over time, their views and their work became even more mainstream, and they did sort of become connected to some of our political leaders. So here you can see some members of what's often called the Islamophobia network or the Islamophobia industry at an event with Steve Bannon, who was part of the first Trump administration. And then we see here on the right a woman named Brigitte Gabriel, who leads the biggest anti-Muslim grassroots organization in the country with President Trump. I think this was before he was elected. It was during his first campaign. But what's what we saw happening in the first Trump administration was that the views of these individuals ended up shaping policy. And for example, the Muslim ban proposal in the first, and which was enacted in the first Trump administration, was justified using research from an anti-Muslim group run by this man. So I remember there was a press conference where Trump is announcing his plans for this Muslim ban at I think the press conference was December 2015, and he cites a study that I had already known about that was put out by this guy's organization. And so this is one of the reasons why I think Islamophobia is sort of mainstreamed on the political right sort of in the last 10 to 15 years. It's really important to say, though, that Islamophobia exists on the left, too. Islamophobia is a bipartisan problem. Liberals are often better rhetorically, but policy-wise, they've also been very harmful. So under President Obama, for example, there was a program called CVE, or Countering Violent Extremism, which sounds sort of like this innocuous program to prevent violence, but basically it was based on the premise that Muslim religiosity was a reason to suspect someone of potential violent activity or potential extremism. And so there were these different pilot programs in different cities across the country, which basically encouraged Muslim communities or others, or like it could be teachers at a university or something like that, to report Muslims to law enforcement if they thought they might be at risk of some kind of violent act. Now, there wasn't necessarily any, there didn't have to be any indication that a person was going to undertake a violent act, but it had to do with, does the person pray a lot, or does the person have certain political views, or things like that. And so this was a program that was instituted under the Obama administration, and I believe continued under the Trump administration too. So both the right and the left have problems with Islamophobia. We can if we're talking about Islamophobia also in terms of foreign policy, and for example, U.S. military incursions into Muslim majority countries. This map here shows Muslim majority countries that were bombed during the Obama presidency. But there are also really positive examples of both Republicans and Democrats resisting Islamophobia too. So I think of Mitt Romney, who was really vocal against the Islamophobia in his party during 2016. Even after 9/11, President Bush immediately went to the mosque in D.C. and said, the people who brought down the towers don't have anything to do with American Muslims, and we should not blame them for this. And I want to point out my friend Imam Hindi here, who's our Muslim chaplain at Georgetown, who was there on that day. Colin Powell was also a really principled, and I actually think the most principled voice when it came to sort of pushing back against the Islamophobia that was leveled actually against President Obama during his run for the presidency. because some people were charging Obama with being a Muslim, and some others, I think it was John McCain, said, no, Obama's not a Muslim, he's a good guy, or Obama's not an Arab, he's a good guy, as if those two things were mutually exclusive. And Colin Powell said, no, even if he was Muslim, even if he was Arab, that shouldn't matter, because being Arab or Muslim isn't a bad thing. And so that was a really important sort of corrective in that moment. I include Bill Clinton here too because I think he and Hillary Clinton have both, and I talk about it in my book, some examples of having not just having some comments that on the face of it were trying to push back against some of the blatant Islamophobic rhetoric of the GOP, but end up falling into some of the same tropes too. Islamophobia is not just an American problem. I talk a lot in my work about American Islamophobia, but this is a problem that spans the globe. Western American stereotypes about Muslims have been exported elsewhere, and also I think also just the history of sort of European encounters with Muslims have also influenced the way that Americans view Islam too. Islamophobia is not even just a Western problem. In places like India, you have the Hindu supremacist party that's currently in power, which often has an anti-Muslim agenda, and there have been pogroms and things like that against Muslim communities in India. And then also in China, you have the persecution of the Uyghur Muslim population, which also is occurring. And so what's sort of troubling about those examples too is the ways that Western stereotypes about Muslims end up being deployed by these governments. We also see Islamophobia in the way that some in the Israeli government or military sort of frame the situation in Gaza. So oftentimes denying Palestinian rights or trying to justify killing that's going on is done, or it's couched in Islamophobic terms. So there's this sort of blanket portrayal of Palestinians as if they're all Hamas or they're all terrorists, and that is very much connected to sort of the anti-Muslim tropes that we've talked about. So I want to come back really quick to some of the racial dynamics that I introduced a little bit at the beginning. But there's this, what happens with Islamophobia is there's often this conflation between identities that are actually distinct. Identities of being Muslim, being Arab, being Middle Eastern. Oftentimes, Arabs are assumed to be Muslim. Being an Arab is just someone who speaks the Arabic language. But there are lots of people who speak the Arabic language who are not Muslim, namely Arab Christians. And here's a great example of an Arab who is not a Muslim, who is a Christian. The reverse is also sort of assumed to be true. Americans often assume that all Muslims are Arab. So if I remember one time my brother was telling me that he met someone or he saw someone and he was like, oh, I saw them praying, and so I knew they were like praying in praying salah, praying as Muslims do, and he basically assumed they were Arab because they were praying in that way. And I had to explain to him, no, I said Muslims are more diverse than just Arabs. But the logic of Islamophobia sort of makes Arabness and Muslimness sort of indistinguishable from each other. And I want to jump ahead really quick to some maps that I think help to disentangle this a little bit. So here we have a map that shows the world Muslim population in terms of sort of density, like, or not density actually, but which countries have, you know, a majority Muslim population, which is the Middle East and North Africa. However, the vast majority of the world's Muslims actually live in Southeast Asia and South Asia. So I love this map too because you can see it sort of quantified a little bit better. So Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, and Muslims are not even a majority in India, and they're still one of the biggest Muslim populations in the world. And so this is just, I think, really helpful to disentangle some of these identities that often get conflated. Another dynamic of Islamophobia is that people who are, quote, visibly Muslim, people who wear headscarves, people who wear face veils or beards, caps, long robes, they often experience discrimination more readily than other Muslims. And so they have been the victims of verbal assaults as well as physical attacks. And in writing my book, I read a lot of really disturbing examples of this. Women who have had their headscarves ripped off of their heads. There was a story of Muslims walking in a park and someone threw a cup of hot coffee at them. Attackers even toppling strollers with babies inside that are being pushed by women who are wearing headscarves. I mean, it's sort of unthinkable. The three individuals in the picture on the right were killed in an anti-Muslim hate crime about 10 years ago, February of 2015, by their neighbor who had made some comments about them being Muslim and the girls wearing hijab, in the days leading up to when he shot them. So I want to just talk briefly about a couple other dynamics, and then we can get into Q&A too, because I have more I could share, but I think having the discussion would be helpful too. But Islamophobia intersects with lots of other forms of bigotry, and you might be sort of wondering, why do I have these bizarre cartoons on the slide? But when I look at anti-Catholic bias in U.S. history, I see so many parallels with anti-Muslim bias today. Here we have cartoons where American Protestants were portraying Catholics as a threat to our way of life in America. Sort of the anti-woman or misogynistic trope, this idea that Catholics are going to be more loyal to foreign law than to U.S. law. I mean, the clerics are even cast as alligators or monsters. These are supposed to be like, bishops' hats, but it's, these crocodiles or alligators coming ashore. So a lot of the similar dynamics that we see with Islamophobia too. The stereotypes that are leveled against Muslims also overlap with the stereotypes leveled against Jews throughout American and European history. There's a new book out. I'm really dying to read it. It's called Jewish Muslims, and it's all about how in the European imagination Jews and Muslims were basically conflated and seen as sort of this other, this indistinguishable other, this religious other. And probably will not be a very fun read, but very, sort of fascinating and I think helpful in light of our current moment. I also talk in the book about how anti-Muslim rhetoric and political policies are similar to anti-Japanese policies and rhetoric during World War II. And then there's other ways that this intersects with racism and bias as well, particularly in the way that bigotries kind of compound each other. So for example, the experience of Black Muslims is different than the experience of Muslims who are white or who are Arab or South Asian, because there's another sort of added dynamic of anti-Black racism in their experience. We've already spoken a little bit about how Islamophobia is not just overt, but it's something that can often be hidden from view or subtle. And there's lots of examples I could give of this, but one of them is these different law enforcement spying programs that have targeted Muslim communities. And I tell a story in the book about a Muslim college student in New York who started a Muslim charity organization. It was a soup kitchen, and they would do other activities. The man who I'm talking about is not in this photo, but this individual, Esed, welcomed a new member into the organization. This young man was joining activities, going to the mosque with them, praying, serving with the group. Well, eventually they found out that this new young man had been sent in by the New York Police Department as an informant or a spy, to basically sort of be eyes and ears in this organization to see if there was any funny business going on. There wasn't any reason, the NYPD didn't have any initial reason why they sent in this person. There was no reason to think that anything was going on, but it was just sort of like a just in case kind of thing. And it was part of this larger program that the NYPD was instituting called the Muslim Mapping Program, where they basically sent spies and informants into Muslim cafes, into Muslim shops, into mosques to just sort of sit and observe and spy on Muslim communities. And so this eventually I think there was I don't remember if it was a Supreme Court case, but there was a case where there was a settlement and there was some some of those who were targeted in this did get some financial sort of compensation for what happened, but the damage was already done in large part because this really eroded a lot of trust that the Muslim community had with law enforcement. And even there are also some cases where these spying programs were undertaken with the goal of actively stirring up trouble in Muslim communities. And so I tell this story in the book, which is kind of mind-boggling, but there was a Muslim community in California, and there was a white convert to Islam who had joined the mosque. And the members of the mosque started to get concerned about this new member because he kept saying all of these sort of troubling things about, oh, I'm really upset about, I don't know, maybe he's like, I'm really upset about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and I think, people should rise up and fight back and this and that. And so the Muslim community actually goes to the local law enforcement and says, we're worried about this guy. This guy's talking about doing bad things. It was law enforcement's own guy. And the trouble is, in other cases, these informants have actually sort of lured individuals to commit acts or to sort of be on the way to committing acts that they might not have been otherwise. And so this is another dynamic that's going on. I'm going to come back to this when I get into some other solutions. So, as we can see, this has been kind of a whirlwind, but Islamophobia is a really multifaceted problem. It has lots of different dynamics. But the thing that I want to make sure doesn't get lost is that Islamophobia is a problem that affects real people, real humans. It hurts individuals and families and communities. And it takes not just a physical and emotional toll, but a psychological toll as well. I've had a number of, at least 2 Muslim friends whose mosques have been targeted in arson, including the one up on the top right corner. I know people who have had their children bullied at school because they're Muslim. I know women who have stopped wearing headscarves because they feel like they're being targeted. As we've already talked about, some Muslims have been injured in hate crimes, or they've lost their family and friends in hate crimes. And so all of this has, real consequences in people's lives. We haven't talked about this case yet, but this was in New Zealand. Many of you probably remember a few years ago there was a massacre in Christchurch across 2 mosques where a white Christian supremacist went into 2 mosques after writing this manifesto and actually filmed himself gunning down 50 Muslims across these 2 mosques. And what was also compounded that was then there were sort of perpetrators of violence here in the U.S. who had been inspired by the events in Christchurch and then committed acts of violence both against synagogues and mosques here in the United States. I'm going to skip over talking about Islamophobia in Christian communities. Again, this has been something that my work is focused on, but we don't have much time to talk about it. But I want to just talk about some of the things that I think we can do to sort of address Islamophobia, whether it's sort of in ourselves, in our campus communities, things like that. And I think one of the first things that we can do is to look inward and actually sort of interrogate our own biases. Ask ourselves, what stereotypes might I have about Muslims that I hold on to, even despite my sort of best intentions? I had an experience when I was living abroad in, again, the country of Jordan. I was sitting on the bed of my host family's house working on my Arabic homework. And this is after I had, I was living in this Muslim majority country. I had already actually lived with a Muslim roommate in college and was studying Islam, and very much aware of this sort of problem of Islamophobia. But I'm sitting there in Jordan, working on my homework, and out the window, I hear this man yelling very loudly in Arabic through a megaphone. And he sounded very angry, very upset. His voice was kind of garbled because he's yelling through this megaphone. And I start to worry. And this was 2012 during the Arab Spring. And so my host mom is sort of walking in the hallway, and I asked her, I said, who's that guy out there? What's he saying? What's going on? Because we'd been warned to students that if there are protests, you shouldn't go. You should sort of steer clear, things like that. I thought this guy might be sort of this political or religious revolutionary. So I asked her, I was like, who's this guy? And she says, oh, he's just selling produce, like fruits and vegetables, out of the back of his truck. He's yelling about potatoes and bananas and tomatoes and zucchini and whatever the deals of the day are. And I felt horrible that I had sort of assumed the worst of whoever this person was, and it made me sort of realize that regardless of, or despite whatever sort of good intentions I had, or this desire to have, overcome my biases, or that I didn't even have any biases. No, I clearly still did. I still was making assumptions about Muslims and about Arabs. And so I just share that example because I think it's really important for us to look inward and try to investigate those things. I mean, sometimes they might only come out in a situation like that where you're sort of smacked in the face by your own bias. But I also think it's important that we actually tell these stories, that we sort of confess them to each other, because that's actually some of the best success that I've had. People coming up to me after other talks like this that I've done and saying, you know what, I actually think I was holding on to this stereotype about Muslims as inherently misogynistic and I need to let that go, or what have you. And so I think being honest about the fact that these stereotypes exist and that we might hold on to them actually gives other people license to sort of begin to unlearn those and admit those to ourselves. I'm just going to run through a couple of these things. I think it's really important that we be supportive of our Muslim friends during hard times. And that we also build relationships during happy times, so that when bad things happen, we have those relationships to fall back on. When it comes to sort of pushing back against Islamophobia in public life and in our communities, one of the things I talk about is that we really have to harness our privilege and whatever our insider status is. So an example that I like to give is Cardinal Joseph Tobin, who's on the right. This is talking to Mike Pence back in my home state of Indiana. Cardinal Tobin was the Archbishop in Indianapolis, and Mike Pence was going to ban Muslim immigration to the state of Indiana. And Mike Pence is I think he grew up Catholic, but he's now a Protestant Christian. But anyway, Tobin, the cardinal, went to his office and basically appealed to Pence's sense of Christianity and sort of their shared values, and was trying to say, don't institute this policy, and I'm going to appeal to you through our shared, Christian language. And so I think we can each reflect on, what is my sort of positionality, what insider status or what privilege do I have, and how can I deploy that to not only defend the rights of Muslims, but whoever the community is that's being targeted. So this is sort of a piece of advice that I think can apply to lots of different things. Another thing that I think is helpful to do is to learn about Islam from Muslims. Now, I say that with a caveat. I currently am teaching a class on Islam as a Catholic to students, so obviously there are sort of exceptions to that rule. A lot of us teach religious traditions that are not our own. But I say this because I think oftentimes, there are a lot of books about Islam that come out of what I talked about as sort of the Islamophobia industry or network that sort of cherry pick negative aspects of the tradition, or don't present a picture of Islam that would be familiar to Muslims themselves. And so I think it's really important that when we're seeking out information on other religious traditions, that we look for things that are seeking to be reflective of Muslims' experience and Muslims' sort of sense of their own religious tradition. Sort of circling back to the Israel-Palestine situation, I think right now we just have to really be on the lookout for when people are engaging in collective blaming or stereotyping when it comes to Muslims, when it comes to Jews, when it comes to others. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Islamophobic violence here in the United States is not just a result of what we're seeing abroad in the Holy Land. I mean, that is happening. But we're also seeing that anti-Muslim ideas or anti-Muslim stereotypes are also a factor in how we interpret the news or how we perceive or interpret government policies or actions that politicians are taking. And so we need to really make sure that the anti-Muslim tropes that exist, we're not using them or not allowing them to dehumanize anyone in our eyes. So we don't want anti-Muslim tropes to allow us to dehumanize Palestinians, just as we don't want all these other stereotypes towards other groups to affect our way of viewing them. if you're interested in sort of diving into this aspect of things further, I worked with a DC-based organization called Shoulder to Shoulder on this primer, which we call a faith-rooted primer for understanding and addressing bigotry in the U.S. amid the violence in Israel-Palestine. So we talk about a lot of these things, common anti-Muslim tropes, common anti-Jewish tropes, what anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim bigotry have in common, all of these different things. And so this is meant to be a resource for faith leaders, but I think it can be broadly helpful to people who are trying to navigate in this moment. And I can always send that link along, or you can Google it too. So finally, I just want to say that, you know, when it comes to addressing Islamophobia, you don't have to be an expert on Islam in order to oppose Islamophobia. You don't have to be able to answer every sort of question about the Islamic tradition in order to stand with Muslims in the face of bigotry. I think that the most important thing actually is to sort of name this, I think, a perennial human problem of scapegoating, and to remind others that this is something that we need to resist. So with that, I'd love to open things up for conversation and discussion, questions, and I really want to thank you all for having me today. Really appreciate it.
All right, let's open it up for questions for Dr. Duffner. She's given us quite a bit of material to work with and think about and process, so if you have a question, please.
Yeah.
This is about language.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, we took a course called World History, and there was one section about the Crusades.
Mm-hmm.
The Crusades were portrayed as this heroic group of people that went and spread Christianity in the Middle East. And then quite much more recently, I learned that one of the worst things you can call a Westerner in Iraq or Afghanistan is a crusader.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Catholic university in Massachusetts, Holy Cross. Their mascot is the Crusaders. And I was wondering if there had been any move to change that name, or you must know about that.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought this up, because this would, if I'd been giving this talk sort of to a Christian audience, I would have certainly brought up the Crusades and this whole dynamic that you're talking about. I actually didn't know that Holy Cross's mascot was still the Crusaders.
So I checked recently; it's still
okay. Yeah, you're right that in a lot of Catholic or Christian contexts, there's sort of a positive connotation with the term Crusader, but it's certainly not that way in the Middle East. And you know, some of the anti-Muslim tropes that that I identified go back all the way to that period. And even before, when we think about European engagement in the Middle East, centuries ago, and one of the things that I highlight in my book, in the book I talk about everything that I just shared with you, but I also add some stuff about contemporary Christian communities, and then also historical Muslim Christian encounters that sort of play into our situation today. And I think one of the things that's a problem is that Christians are often really familiar with the bad things that Muslims have done to them over the centuries, but not necessarily the bad things that our community has done to Muslims, including the Crusades, including the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, including other things which I didn't even know about until I was working on the book, like one of the papal documents or papal bulls that was issued to sort of give license to European colonizers to come to this country also actually includes some language about subduing the Saracens. Subduing, that was the word that was often used to talk about Muslims at the time. And I had no idea. And I don't think many Catholics or many Christians do. And so I think one of the sort of important and maybe often overlooked dynamics in terms of upending Islamophobia is just helping all of us to have a fuller picture of history, and to recognize that no one's been perfect, no one's a saint, but we can't portray ourselves in the best possible light and then malign others, because that creates an imbalance that just isn't really true to life and true to history. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
So, in like a political realm, a lot of times we see like the support of the state of Israel being just like the smart political decision. Do you think like because obviously in the United States we have this very like significant moment of 9/11 as kind of this like cornerstone of development in Islamophobia. Do you think there's like an aspect abroad, specifically like in Westernness abroad, that's like this allyship to America, or do you think it's a completely separate like realm? Like, do you think it developed more after 9/11 the same, or do you think it is kind of a completely separate beast abroad?
I want to make sure I understand your question. So you're asking whether or not like the Israel-Palestine situation is like contributes to.
Not necessarily Israel-Palestine, just kind of like, sorry, I'm trying to like reword it without saying the exact same thing.
Yeah. No, I
just more like, in the way that we talk about supporting Israel as being like a political decision, an economic decision, right? Do you think like, in kind of agreeing with America on a lot of these Islamophobic ideas and actions and just practices, do you think it's more of a allyship with the United States, or do you think it's more of a completely separate thing that happens abroad, not necessarily aligned with Israel-Palestine per se? Did I word it?
I don't know. I you might be thinking on a whole different level than I am.
That's okay.
I don't know. Let me think on it.
Okay.
And I'll get back to you.
Okay.
And I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I also said it was a long question, so like, it was loaded, so it's alright.
I mean, I do think, and again, I don't think this is totally answering your question, but one of the dynamics that I didn't talk about quite as much, but that some scholars have really been sort of revisiting lately on the question on Islamophobia is, again, asking like how organic Islamophobia is versus is it sort of drummed up because it's a tool that can be used to support certain U.S. policies abroad. And so a lot of people actually want to trace sort of the genesis of Islamophobia actually to sort of the U.S. Sort of allyship with Israel and maybe like the 1967 war or different things like that. And basically sort of the point I was making before about how it's a lot easier to subdue the Palestinians if they're portrayed in a certain way. And, you know, a lot of the sort of the targeting of advocates for Palestinian rights is not brand new. There were similar things actually going on in the 90s, which, you know, many of us sort of don't know about or got ignored. But this isn't sort of a brand new problem. And there are definitely connections with the situation abroad, so.
So you mentioned how Islamophobia often ends up as a political tool. I've seen in certain discussions on it on social media how the current form of Zionism has often utilized Islamophobia, and some discussions insist that the current form of Zionism is inherently Islamophobic. Would you say that's an accurate portrayal, or is there a way to separate Islamophobia from Zionism?
So I am aware that there are different forms of Zionism. You know, there are some who would advocate for a Jewish presence in the land between the river and the sea that does not entail a political subjugation of the Palestinian population, like maybe a cultural Zionism or a religious Zionism that wants to see a Jewish presence, in the land of Israel, sort of broadly construed, but that doesn't necessarily see that as entailing a particular political project of, Jews having certain rights that Palestinians don't. When it comes to, the kinds of policies and ideologies of the current, Israeli government or people in the current Israeli government, I don't know if I would necessarily universally call it Islamophobia, but there's definitely sort of a way that Palestinian rights are being denied or they're trying to justify that in a certain way. And I don't think that's always, about Islam, because again, there's lots of Palestinian Christians too. But I think oftentimes the way that the discourse works is that the existence of Palestinian Christians is often erased, and if all Palestinians are framed as Muslims, and if we're afraid of Muslims, then it's just sort of easier to subdue the Palestinians, kind of a thing. It's not only Islamophobia, certainly, and I definitely wouldn't want to say that Islamophobia is inherent to Zionism, though those dynamics exist in some circles, I think. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask if you could go back to the slide where you identify Islamophobia.
Like the definition?
Yes.
Yeah. And I believe this photo was actually taken, I should have mentioned this before, at a mosque in Quebec, where there was a massacre of, I think, 6 or 7 Muslims who were killed by a Christian shooter, and it was a really, obviously, tragic and horrible sort of case of Islamophobia in Canada, probably one of the worst. What was really sort of moving in the wake of that, though, was the Catholic parish and cardinal in Quebec hosted this big mass where they prayed for the dead, and then they invited like the head of the mosque and some other people there. And I actually think I have a picture of that. Where did it go? Oh yeah, here it is. Yeah, so here's all of these Catholic priests, and this is the cardinal, and he's hugging the president of the mosque, and I know it was a really sort of moving and cathartic experience for everyone, because there was a lot of reporting on it. So.
The slide, the chart, the New York Times article that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
So there, I can understand that you said that there is this surge in Muslim assault during the election years.
Mm-hmm.
But even let's say this 2010,
Yeah.
63, 55, 58, 50s, which is kind of high rise where there are no election years.
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
And Obama is there, who was most supportive of Muslims. Why do we still have this assault?
Yeah,
And,
this is
yeah.
super fascinating. Do you want to? You can continue.
And that, my another question is different, but maybe
Sure.
we can address this one.
Sure. So 2010 was a really interesting year, and I didn't talk about this. So some of you were probably young children then, but this was during what we called the Ground Zero Mosque controversy. So some of the people in the other slides that I was showing, Pamela Geller, Robert Spencer, these are these like bloggers, pundits, who basically created this hysteria around what was effectively a Muslim YMCA that was being built, like a Muslim community center gym place that was being built in downtown Manhattan, not too far from where the Twin Towers were. And this actually was a midterm year, so there was a political dimension to it. And so ahead of the midterms, when the GOP were trying to get control of Congress, this was sort of a politically expedient thing because they had these anti-Muslim activists were drumming up all this fear about Muslims, and it was right around the 10th anniversary of 9/11 too. And so this is when that sort of fringe anti-Muslim network that I was talking about really starts to sort of gain a foothold on Fox News and with like some senators and other Congress people, and then eventually sort of make their way to Trump by this point. So that explains sort of this rise here. This is also when there was a lot of fear around Sharia. All of these like protests around we're against Sharia law, and all these bills that were put forward and sometimes passed in state legislatures that were authored by actually not authored by this guy, but he was very instrumental in these too, to basically get state legislatures to outlaw the consideration of Sharia law. It was sort of a solution for a problem that they created, like not an actual sort of threat or not an actual issue. And the thing that I found so interesting during that whole period of this anti-Sharia hysteria was that if you would go to these rallies, these anti-Sharia rallies, and ask your average American, what is Sharia law, they usually couldn't tell you. It was just this scary Arabic word that had been redefined in this sort of scary way, but people didn't actually really even know what they were protesting. It was just, this is this thing that these scary Muslims do, sort of a thing. Yeah. Thanks for that. What was your other question?
So then you also talked about Islamophobia being like kind of not only the Western thing, it's also in the Eastern part and other countries across the world. So the reason in the Western you just mentioned, and maybe Christian crusades and other things, and we don't talk about it
Yeah.
when we talk about this. And of course, Israel, Jerusalem being one of the central hub points of that. What about East Asian countries like China, Japan, or even Southeast Asian countries like Singapore and Thailand and Cambodia and those countries, or Myanmar, India? They did not have the treatment that Christians give to Muslims. They have not done that. And on the contrary, there are Muslims who have invaded these countries and kind of ruled over there for hundreds of years. Why do they have Islamophobia in all those parts? Because their history is totally different from Western history.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of different answers, or there's a lot of different dynamics going on, and I'm even thinking about a friend of mine in my PhD program. He did his whole PhD dissertation on the hysteria around halal meat in South Korea, which I also did not know was a thing. That there was this sort of anti-Muslim fear or fervor in South Korea over the halal meat industry. I think in places like China, Muslims are a minority, and I think maybe I don't know the Chinese context as well as some of my colleagues, but if the government is trying to normalize a particular way of being Chinese and to sort of like homogenize the country, and Uyghur Muslims have a particular culture or way of doing things, or certain religious practices that they want to maintain, there has been sort of a desire to make them conform to what the norm is, and to homogenize. And so one of my colleagues talks about how both in India and in China, there has been sort of an adopting of the Western like tropes about Islam, or the sort of securitizing rhetoric, sort of treating Muslims as a security threat. Not simply, it's not something that comes necessarily organically out of these countries, but it's, these governments have particular policies that they want to enact, and so Islamophobia kind of becomes a tool for them to be able to enact those things. So it's hard for me to, give reasons for all these different contexts, but, I do think that American and Western Islamophobia really sort of has an impact on how Islamophobia looks in other parts of the world too, even if it's not identical.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Duffner again for her time and her wisdom. And just to let you know that the Khatib program in Religion and Dialogue will be planning more events in the fall. And if you have ideas, please feel free to email me. I'm always looking for ways to make a difference on campus. Thank you.
And maybe I'll see some of you in
In
class
class,
next
that's right, Mondays and Wednesdays.